Good morning. I'm Remo, and Russian strikes have killed at least 16 people in Kyiv overnight, including a 6-year-old child. This is the Daily Signal for August 1st, 2025. Stay tuned for the rest of the stories.
Unfiltered. Now,
Here are the other top stories for August 1st, 2025. Trump implements new tariffs on 92 countries effective next week, with rates varying dramatically by nation. Top Trump administration officials head to Gaza as humanitarian crisis reaches critical levels. El Salvador's ruling party proposes constitutional changes allowing indefinite presidential re-election. Young Ukrainians celebrate victory as President Zelensky overturns controversial law amid growing protests. Scientists discover Australia's heaviest stick insect, breaking records in the outback. Trump declares Canada's support for Palestinian statehood makes trade deals very hard to negotiate. Myanmar establishes interim government ahead of elections, but military general retains ultimate control. New investigation reveals the mathematical calculations behind Gaza's escalating famine crisis. Israeli Minister Ben-Gvir accuses Germany of once again supporting Nazism in explosive diplomatic confrontation. Now let's dive into each story. Breaking overnight. Russian missiles and drones slammed into residential buildings across Kiev, killing at least 16 civilians, including a 6-year-old boy. Over 130 people were injured in what Ukrainian officials are calling one of the deadliest attacks on the capital this year. The strikes hit the Sviatoshinsky district hardest, where entire apartment sections were reduced to rubble. Rescue teams are still pulling survivors from the debris, with several people reported missing. Schools and hospitals were damaged in the bombardment. Here's what makes this attack particularly shocking. These were cruise missiles targeting homes, not military installations. Ukrainian President Zelensky called it a deliberate act of terror against civilians, constituting a war crime under international law. Ukrainian air defenses managed to shoot down dozens of incoming weapons, but several missiles broke through, causing devastating damage. The 6-year-old victim was found in the wreckage of his family's apartment building. Why this matters? This represents a significant escalation in Russia's targeting of civilian infrastructure, occurring just as international diplomatic efforts were showing signs of progress. President Trump signed an executive order yesterday implementing new tariffs on 92 countries, effective August 7th. That's next week. But here's the surprise. The rates vary dramatically based on each country's trade relationship with America. Taiwan faces a 20% tariff, Pakistan 19%, while countries like Israel, Iceland, and Ecuador get 15%. Lesotho, originally threatened with a 50% rate, dodged a bullet with only 15%. Any country not specifically listed gets a baseline 10% tariff. This affects 68 individual countries plus the entire 27-member European Union bloc. The White House says these rates reflect each nation's trade imbalances and economic policies toward the United States. Trump's team positioned this as a negotiating tactic, giving countries until his self-imposed deadline to agree to more favorable trade terms. Several nations have already requested emergency trade talks. The real story: this is the largest simultaneous tariff implementation in modern U.S. history, potentially affecting billions in global trade within days. Top Trump administration officials are heading to Gaza this week as the humanitarian crisis reaches what aid organizations are calling catastrophic levels. This marks the highest-level U.S. visit to the territory in years. The delegation includes senior State Department and USAID officials, though the White House hasn't released their specific names for security reasons. They'll assess conditions firsthand and meet with humanitarian organizations struggling to deliver aid. Here's the critical detail. Gaza's population is facing severe food shortages, with international observers warning of imminent famine conditions. Medical facilities are operating at 15% capacity due to fuel and supply shortages. The visit comes amid growing international pressure on the U.S. to increase humanitarian assistance. Aid deliveries have been severely limited due to ongoing security concerns and infrastructure damage. Why this matters to you? This could signal a major shift in U.S. policy toward Gaza, potentially affecting regional stability and America's relationships with key allies. El Salvador's governing party just proposed constitutional changes that would allow President Nayib Bukele to run for re-election indefinitely. Currently, the Constitution limits presidents to a single 5-year term. The proposal requires approval from 2 consecutive legislative sessions, but Bukele's party controls a supermajority in parliament. If passed, this would make El Salvador the latest Latin American country to eliminate presidential term limits. Bukele, who's already serving his 2nd term through a controversial constitutional interpretation, maintains an approval rating above 85% due to his crackdown on gang violence. Critics argue this move undermines democratic institutions. The proposal also includes changes to judicial appointments and emergency powers, provisions that human rights groups say could consolidate authoritarian control. The bigger picture. This continues a troubling trend across Latin America, where popular leaders are extending their power through constitutional changes, echoing patterns seen in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Young Ukrainians are celebrating a rare political victory after President Zelensky reversed a controversial law following widespread youth protests. The law, which critics said unfairly restricted young people's rights during wartime, was overturned after demonstrations in major cities. Thousands of university students and young professionals had taken to the streets despite martial law restrictions, arguing the legislation was discriminatory and unnecessary. Social media campaigns using the hashtag #YouthRights gained millions of views. Zelensky announced the reversal during a televised address, acknowledging that Ukraine's youth deserve consideration and that the law did not reflect our democratic values, even in wartime. This is significant because it shows Ukrainian civil society remains active despite the ongoing war. Young protesters argued they were fighting for the same democratic principles that Ukraine is defending against Russia. What this tells us, even during wartime, Ukrainian democracy is adapting and responding to public pressure, a stark contrast to authoritarian systems where dissent is crushed. Scientists in Australia have discovered what they're calling the continent's heaviest stick insect, weighing in at over 25 grams. That's heavier than a mouse. The giant insect was found in Queensland's remote wilderness areas. The species, temporarily dubbed Goliathus queenslandensis, measures nearly 8 inches long, with a wingspan reaching 10 inches. Researchers say it's likely been living in isolated forest canopies for millennia, escaping scientific detection. Here's what makes this discovery remarkable. Most stick insects weigh less than a paperclip. This giant breaks all previous Australian records and ranks among the heaviest insects globally. The discovery team from Queensland University spent 3 years tracking reports from local Aboriginal communities who knew about these giant ghost sticks for generations. Why this matters? The discovery highlights Australia's incredible biodiversity and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in scientific research. It also suggests many more species remain undiscovered in Australia's remote regions. President Trump explicitly stated yesterday that Canada's support for Palestinian statehood makes any U.S.-Canada trade deal very hard to negotiate. This links foreign policy positions directly to economic agreements in an unprecedented way. Canada recently joined several nations in recognizing Palestinian statehood, a move that frustrated the Trump administration. Now Trump is using trade negotiations as leverage to influence Canada's Middle East policies. This is a major departure from traditional trade diplomacy, where economic and foreign policy issues are typically kept separate. Canadian officials called the linkage inappropriate and counterproductive. The statement comes as both countries are renegotiating key trade provisions worth billions in bilateral commerce. Agricultural exports, energy partnerships, and manufacturing deals are all on the table. The real impact: this precedent could reshape how America conducts trade diplomacy, using economic access to pressure allies on unrelated foreign policy positions. Myanmar has established an interim government ahead of promised elections, but here's the catch: the top military general remains in ultimate control. This arrangement satisfies virtually no one in Myanmar's complex political landscape. The interim government includes civilian technocrats and some opposition figures, But all major decisions require approval from the military council, led by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who led the 2021 coup. Elections are scheduled for sometime in 2025, though no specific date has been announced. Opposition groups are calling it a sham transition, designed to legitimize continued military rule under civilian window dressing. The arrangement has satisfied neither pro-democracy activists nor international observers, who view it as cosmetic changes rather than genuine reform. What's really happening? Myanmar's military is attempting to create the appearance of democratic transition while maintaining authoritarian control, a strategy seen in other countries where militaries want international legitimacy without giving up power. A new investigation breaks down what researchers call the mathematics of starvation, a detailed analysis of how policy decisions have created famine conditions in Gaza. The study uses statistical models to trace cause and effect. Researchers calculated that current food deliveries meet only 38% of Gaza's minimum nutritional needs. The investigation tracks how border restrictions, destroyed infrastructure, and limited aid approval create a mathematical formula for hunger. Here are the stark numbers. Gaza's population requires 2,400 calories per person daily for basic survival. Current aid deliveries provide an average of just 910 calories per person. The study documents how policy decisions directly correlate with malnutrition rates, using epidemiological data to show how administrative restrictions translate into human suffering. Why these numbers matter? This mathematical approach could influence international legal proceedings and humanitarian policy, turning abstract policy debates into concrete data about human survival. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir accused Germany of once again supporting Nazism in an explosive diplomatic confrontation over Germany's criticism of Israeli policies in Gaza. The statement has triggered the worst Israel-Germany diplomatic crisis in decades. Ben-Gvir's comments came after Germany joined other European nations in calling for increased humanitarian access to Gaza and questioning some Israeli military tactics. German officials called the Nazi comparison outrageous and historically inappropriate. This is particularly shocking given Germany's special relationship with Israel, built on Holocaust remembrance and Germany's commitment to Israeli security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz demanded an immediate apology and called the comments deeply offensive. The Israeli government has not distanced itself from Ben-Gvir's remarks, despite growing international criticism. Several European nations are reconsidering diplomatic engagements with Israel. The broader implications: this confrontation could reshape European-Israeli relations and reflects growing international isolation of some Israeli positions. Germany remains one of Israel's strongest supporters, making this diplomatic break particularly significant. Looking across today's stories, three major themes emerge that will shape the coming weeks. First, authoritarian consolidation is accelerating globally. From El Salvador's unlimited re-election proposal to Myanmar's controlled transition, we're seeing democratic institutions under pressure worldwide. Even Ukraine, fighting for democracy, faces internal tensions over wartime restrictions. Second, trade policy is becoming weaponized diplomacy. Trump's tariff variations by country and his explicit linking of Canada's foreign policy to trade deals represent a fundamental shift in how economic relationships serve political goals. Third, humanitarian crises are being documented with unprecedented precision. Whether it's the mathematical analysis of Gaza's famine or real-time casualty reporting from Kiev, data is becoming central to humanitarian advocacy and international accountability. These aren't separate stories, they're interconnected trends that reveal how 2025 is reshaping international relations, democratic institutions, and humanitarian responses. Your takeaway: we're witnessing a period where economic tools, democratic norms, and humanitarian crises are intersecting in ways that will define global politics for years to come. That's the Daily Signal for August 1st, 2025. I'm Remo. Subscribe for tomorrow's essential news and share this with someone who needs to stay informed. Until tomorrow, stay curious and stay informed.
Unfiltered. Now.